We are honored to have both the speakers with us for this session. Our first speaker would be Professor Avanish Kumar, and the second speaker would be Dr. Archana Shukla Mukherjee. Professor Avanish Kumar, he is faculty with Management Development Institute, India, Gurgaon. At India, he is not only the faculty member, but also the chairperson for postgraduate program in public policy and management. His work and research interests revolve around mainstreaming the marginalized, particularly focusing on the citizen-centric governance, sustainable models of rural livelihoods, corporate social responsibility. Before getting associated with MDI Gurgaon, he has been a faculty member at Terry University, and he has been engaged with UNDP, UNEP, London School of Economics, Delhi School of Economics, so on and so forth. It's an endless list. So I welcome you, Professor Avanish Kumar, and I think...
Thank you so much.
I think we can dedicate fairly 20 minutes to this talk. So over to you, sir.
Thank you. Before I start, first of all, I would like to thank Nilika ma'am and Patnaik sir and all the organizers for inviting me. I want to start with a surprise, which many of you may not be aware, that there is always a pride and, which you actually associate with of being first. And I don't know whether Professor Nilika ma'am and Professor Patnaik sir is aware about it, but I am their first student. They started teaching, we were the first batch. So I always carry that. They are like my elder brother and sister, but I have always been guided by them. And many things which I may say correct or which may be valuable, maybe which I have learned from them. All these things which I speak, which is not so good, is maybe from my side. So what I have focused today is today's session that I have titled as Paradigm of Policy Research. And the question is, with the larger question of the workshop, that will COVID-19 unset surprises? I have basically structured this particular session of 20 minutes basically into three components. First of all, how COVID and anthropology and public policy can unset this, the policy research, because largely I don't have guts to speak to the faculties. What I'll address to by assumption that I'm speaking to the research scholars and who are continuing with their young research portfolios. The third part, which I conclude with very shortly. So if I ask some of the questions like, the stir of COVID-19 is beyond day-to-day life, multiple questions are pricking the mind. Will COVID-19 oust the current paradigm of economic value creation? Will it change the notion of capital, whether it is social capital, natural capital, financial capital? Will it change daily wage employee-employer relationship? Will it change the lives and working of the basically people who are working in corporates or in the government? Will it actually create a shift in education system? We have already seen a new education policy. Will it shift priority of government towards decentralized healthcare or public system or infrastructure delivery? Or will it seize the traditional governance structure and surge into virtual platforms? Many of these questions, and these are endless, though the history of post-disaster correction across the world suggests that all these questions, the answer remains unanimously yes. One among the million dilemma which we actually face is, will my research, and I'm talking to the research scholars basically, will my research hold relevance post-COVID? That's the question I want to ponder with. It has created fissure in the mind of research scholars, especially scholars pursuing fieldwork. To reflect on unsetting goalposts due to COVID, it is important to understand that the failure in research are not or will not be because what one has gathered, but it would be because what has left out. So we should be very careful in what we leave as part of our research. Therefore, there is an urgent need to identify and fill the validity gap, or for what I may call it is the life expectancy of research beyond COVID. COVID basically being a public health pandemic, research scholars needs to assess how far the scientific uncertainty leads to distortion or inaction in the domain of research scope and the field methods of data collection, because that happens to be the anthropologist basically tools of experimentation. it would require considerations of issues around timing, communication, research, results. Post-COVID, there is need to pay attention to, in the policy research, policy environment, work environment, natural environment, looking into just not policy content, but may also be the process of policy conceptualization and profit making. What do I mean by conceptualization is the whole paradigm of conceptualization may change. What do I mean by profit? May change after, let's say, COVID, because let's say in corporate world also, which may be the part of the second session, the profit may be purposive profit. That's the health of or well-being of an employee. So things will change as conceptualization is concerned. Situation like COVID may redefine rational or the scientific discussion about methods, measurements, even meaning, be it inference or conclusion. This paper, when Professor Nilika ma'am invited me, is actually an extension of a lecture which I delivered in Ambedkar University on 10th of June. So it is not exactly the same lecture, but it is an extension of that lecture because some component of the lecture was also deliberated on that day. For me, being a social anthropologist, it is very difficult to proclaim knowledge of anthropology in totality. I think even our founders, whether E.B. Tyler or Malinowski, may not represent all aspects or dimensions of anthropology. So before I start, I would like to limit myself. I'm not being biased, but I limit myself that my working as a social anthropology or applied anthropology is actually on the domain of public policy, sustainability, and governance. Therefore, my thoughts are not biased, but it do exclude physical anthropology and archaeology. The second part which I want to focus on is anthropology and public policy. Now, as a discipline, there's a natural convergence. Where does it come from? I like to share. I don't want to bore you much, but I just want to start with setting the context. What is said is that every discipline is respected and dedicated for truth seeking. There's no discipline which do not seek truth. Probably, but anthropology is the only discipline where the turf to search for truth exists beyond textbook, beyond museum, excavation, society, or even real-life laboratory. In fact, in a famous chapter by Akhil Gupta and James Ferguson, which is called as a discipline and practice, the field as site, method and location in anthropology, it states that in terms of professional socialization and training too, ethnographic fieldwork is at the core of what Stocking calls as anthropology fundamental methodological values, the taken for granted pre-theoretical notions of what it is to do as an anthropology, or it says what to be as an anthropologist. So anthropologists basically are, as a social anthropologist, we are directly or consciously or unconsciously associated with fieldwork. And I think what I want to pitch today is that is going to change as a notion. Anthropology as a discipline have an important political role in representing. This is written by Mills in 2003, reproducing and promoting the discipline within and beyond the academy. Anthropology, with its scientific grounded in society and also in the kind of understanding which we have with people's choices, alternate solutions. This strategic shift in anthropological discipline makes it holistic and allows liberty to use the best of science and social science approaches. In fact, I borrow the definition of, though it sounds rhetoric, but still I would like to take American Anthropological Association definition, which says that anthropological study and training provides knowledge, skills, tools to work with people, study the past and shape the future. If we have to shape the future, we have to link with basically practice and policies because that is the larger domain of influence. This changing paradigm of basically closed society, community, and culture has allowed anthropologists, to the best of my knowledge, to stretch its application in modern, relatively bordered societies, scattered community, plural culture. Today, anthropologists just don't do any work in exotic locations. In fact, Good Enough in his article basically wrote Anthropology in 20th century and beyond, that anthropology virtually covers all facets of human existence and human history from its very beginning, actually. Significant advancement has been taken place, and basically what it leads to, one of the best known advocate of the use of anthropology to facilitate the process of colonial rule, to the best of my knowledge, is Ratkill Brown, because his School of African Studies at University of Cape Town developed an effort to reduce the conflict between black and white. paved the way for an increased anthropological presence in British colonial system. In fact, so much so that there is a study which says that during the East India Time Company, the bureaucrats had to be trained in anthropology before they joined in India as a part of the administration. Many American anthropologists, for example, has been recruited during the Second World War. And this study actually, if you talk about it, goes beyond the list of during 1920 to 60. But I think in the development world, one thing which changed was not one individual, but the whole discourse of participatory governance and participatory research, which I can basically refer to Robert Chambers, who is also an anthropologist. And this led to, in fact, there is a data and study which says that USAID, DFID, and others, whereby the recruitment of anthropologists increased because the USAID, the American guideline, which actually included the knowledge and request basically of anthropological literature. However, in recent years, anthropological boundaries have become more porous. In fact, I am reminded of one of the article which was published in Harvard Business Review in 2014, whereby it's a beautiful case whereby the owner of a beer company actually hired anthropologists to understand why the sale is dipping. And the article is titled as When Anthropologist Enters the Bar. And through the ethnographic knowledge, they provided solutions which others could not actually provide them. So anthropologists have been part of the business solutions as well. Now, very quickly, because time is short, I would like to come up into the issues of anthropology and the state or the public policy. And as I said, that there is also some literature which talks about conflict, not conflict, but disagreement, because Malinowski, as it is written, actually advocated a role for anthropology as policy advisors to African colonial administration. But Evans featured them instead to do actually precisely the opposite and distance themselves from the tainted world of policymakers and applied involvement. Then, when we see literature, we also trace that there are many British social anthropologists such as Ivan Pritchard, Gluckman, Raymond Firth, Frederick Barth. All these have been involved in social policies and so forth. One of the famous book by Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict also talks about some kind of basically policy interventions. We have seen evidence in Indian anthropology also. The whole spatial multipurpose block was also introduced through and also evaluated by the chairperson, none other than called Veeral Elvin. And there are several other initiatives which are part of this particular issue. Now, very quickly, I would like to share and quote that once Franz Boas referred this as the service of truth. And the Boas, when he was the first president, he actually said that, suggested that anthropologists need to basically preserve a distinction between spies and scholars, because there was a claim that anthropologists were working on basically for the states as a spies. What I'm trying to say here is, when we do a policy research, there is a need to actually create not only integrity of research, which I follow, but which is also established through my research and methodology, so that people who are reading my research also understand that there is no bias which is actually entailed in the research. So one thing which policy research actually, which I think which COVID may actually hit largest, would be the observation as a method, which I believe it may go on ventilator, not observation per se, but the traditional observation method which is followed. Policy learning would basically require improved understanding, maybe not without observation, but observation may become a challenge. I'll give you one example. During the time of COVID, there was one decision by the Chief Minister of Delhi, Arvind Kejriwal, not to allow citizens from outside Delhi to actually avail the health facilities. But the Lieutenant Governor went against it. And the moral dilemma was that health is for all. But if you see the other side of it, it could lead to, am I running short of time? No? Okay. So the other side of it could be that it would have developed health infrastructure all across. It would have led to decentralized development of health infrastructure. So what is there to be understood is that a clear conceptualization of policy learning is essential for research that seeks to identify the extent to and the condition under which learning takes place. Now, I will just try to differentiate the learning as far as the conceptualization of policy issue is concerned. Policy issues are basically conceptualized in two different brackets. They are interrelated, but certainly they are not two separate entities, but they have to be looked into a very dedicated framework. One is a policy learning, and second one is a political learning. Policy learning is generally divided into instrument policy learning and social policy learning. Instrument policy learning basically entails lessons about the validity of policy instruments. Policy instruments, what you call as scheme, and the rights and the political rights and the citizens' rights and civil rights, or implementation design. The social policy learning entails basically the social construction of policy problem. Let's say the problem of COVID for the migrants, the problem of lockdown, problem of social distancing, now how it impacted the stigma of the people, or maybe poverty. These are the social learning and the scope of policy or policy goals. The second component is the political learning, because policy is a political framework. In fact, literature says that there is no policy decision which are accepted unless until the decision maker, who is the legislative power in India, traditionally speaking, though in the modern framework, there is another form of policy making through the executive power. That is like odd and even was through executive power. It was not through the legislative power, which is like member of parliament. And there is another form of emergence of the kind of movement with civil society, which we call as demosprudence, whereby the judiciary initiates policy making. So it is not only judiciary, but the political decisions are very important. And the literature says very clearly that the politicians or the policymakers never take a call unless until they feel that this decision will elevate their position. So we need to understand the political learning also. And what are the political learning? The policy processes and the prospects. The policy advocates become more sophisticated in advancing problem and ideas by learning how to enhance the political feasibility of a policy problem or a proposal. What does it mean? That one has to understand, does it lead to administrative ease? Does it lead to a rational argument about well-being? Because this is how it is done. Now, if this has to be analyzed, there are certain parameters on which we analyze. Like all these can be analyzed, learning about what do we do, what is the focus of the policy, what are the prerequisite conditions of policy, what are the primary basically indicators to assess this policy, what are the potential basically assumptions, and what are the evidences which are required. Now, in the policy research, it is very important to actually argue for validity or logical explanation. And what I mean to say is that when there is a logical explanation, what is said, that justification of empirical proposition is very important. It is not about truth. You may not know the truth, or you may have the belief that this will make a change. You have justification for it, but you have to have a justification of empirical proposition. What do I mean by justification for empirical position is that you have to describe the conditions. What is also called as reliabilism, that knowledge have been arrived at using a reliable procedure. And that is something which is very critical. In fact, one thing is also an important learning, which is slightly different from policy research and other research, that what John raised in the recent article, which was published in World Development, and in the last issue, and he writes against that policy is not about only scientific matters and evidence. Policy is also political decisions. So he says that apart from evidence, what is required is, one, he says, understanding. Second is values. And I believe which anthropological values, which is inculcated in all of us, is very clear, that we take the sides of the people. And the third one is deliberation, that is the engagement. Now, understanding can build a kind of a basically differentiate between what is called as symptoms and what are called as the causes. I'll just give you an example that understanding in policy why it is important, because suppose you see that people are there on the streets after COVID, and all these people are migrants and rushing towards actually to catch a train or a bus to go back home. Now, this is a symptom, this is not a condition. Now, in order to understand this situation, what Clifford Geertz says is that you have to become more than a camera. Now, that requires that you understand what leads to this situation. If you understand the causation of this particular symptom, then only you can set the direction for future. So in policy research, you have to actually create a kind of a direction. Without value judgment, you cannot create a judgment direction, because in a policy, you always take sides. And in welfare states, we always take an argument which is rational argument towards the pro-poor. So the value has to be justified on that direction. Third thing is deliberation, that how do we actually lead to deliberation? And that is something which is very critical for policy research. Now, what is cause and effect is slightly different from this. I have taken some understanding from even David Hume, basically, who talks about cause and effect. Largely, what in anthropology, you can talk about how causes precedes this effect, how cause and effect are contagious also, how these are constant correlations. That suppose the lockdown increases, the degree of lockdown vis-a-vis the degree of frustration in the minds of the people. So these are some of the things which can be talked about, but largely this is something which is not so clear as far as policy is concerned. Now, based on this, basically list of several factors that contributes to some kind of understanding that needs to be understood and identified. Basically, it is said that if you can identify the necessary conditions within which this happens, and that is something which is actually important in policy. Now I'll go into one thing which is like, what is the policy problem, public policy problem, I'm saying, for exploration. Now, it could be public goods problem, lack of access, societal disconnection, social distancing, social priority, ignorance of politicians, policymakers, health workers, power relations. Now, in this, what we do is, and where do we mistake when we do policy research is, when we actually identify a problem, in policy research, you have to describe a problem. Describe a problem means that it should actually have a sense of direction for what do we want to collect and how do we want to collate. And the second important component of describing a problem is how do actually this description helps me to structure my argument and present my analysis. So basically, in this case, what we do is a sense of direction, describe the problem in a manner that it gives us a sense of direction. What are the data? What are the information which I need to collect and collate? Second is, how do I structure my argument? Because in policy studies, it's very critical to actually structure an argument, because ultimately it has to fit it into the administrative setup and also the institutional goal. This leads to the research question. Based on the problem, now what is said that a good research questions may not necessarily produce a good research, but a poorly conceived or a constructed question is most likely to create problems that affect all subsequent stages of a study. Therefore, in a policy study, qualitative inquiries involves asking kinds of questions that focuses on why and how of human interactions, one. The second is basically the need to articulate what a researcher wants to know about the intention and perspective of those involved in social interaction. Let me just suggest like this, that suppose you want to understand the stress of paramedic staff who are working in COVID in hospital. Now, you have to be clear on, like Professor Patnaik said, that you have to be clear what question you want to ask. So he's saying to squeeze that in 1 minute, that means that he's trying to build the articulation skills. Now, if I'm not sure what do I want to ask, I'll get a blur response. So it is very important in policy research to know what kind of questions which I want to know and what is the kind of. Then is creating one or two basically broad questions and get into something which is very important. Asking some quantifiable, like a close-ended question, is like what Maxwell calls tunnel vision. We have to go beyond that. So we have to ask something why and the process-oriented questions, and that is something leads to a kind of theoretical framework and a kind of theoretical underpinning. Now I'll go into some of these issues of basically where does this, because I am running short on my time. Yeah,
yes, we have maybe 1 or 2 more minutes to.
Okay. I'll just close in 2 minutes.
Sure.
That when we conceptualize this particular issue, where is the problem? As far as if you're trying to analyze this particular problem of policy conceptualization or conceptualization of issue for policy study. One is that we are not able to eliminate or eradicate difference in perception. Because suppose you say poverty has different multiple perceptions. So how do you differentiate and create a consistency of your argument? That is a very important thing. The second thing is differing benchmark. Now, by poverty, when you say that 31 rupees 29 paisa is the below poverty line, do you make a benchmark of 31 rupees? Do you want to say that 31 rupees 29 paisa allows a decent way of living? So there is a benchmark which has to be there. The third part, which is very, very critical, that there are gray areas. Now, in policy, it is said that it is very strategically ambiguous words are used. This is basically used to make a feel good language to actually have a consensus, and that needs to be avoided. Now, I'm short of time, so what I do is that I'll conclude with some of these. That there is a book by Jeremy, basically McClency, which was published in second edition was published in 2019. That Exotic No More Anthropology for Contemporary World. This is an edited book, and thereby this book basically suggests what could be the future lie in anthropology. And some of these are anthropologists engaged in analysis of pathologies of vulnerable population, which is our area of domain. Anthropological ethnographical critiques of key concepts. What I mean by concepts is that I can deliberate later that how do we conceptualize empowerment? That is itself is an issue, phenomena. Then expertise and experience of anthropologists in indirect interventions may not be always action anthropology. So, and reflection on ethnographic sites that may recently be moved to the forefront of the discipline, often as a result. Last two lines, which I would like to conclude, is as a suggestion, not to seniors, but to juniors and maybe my colleagues, that what I have realized that the once an anthropologist remains anthropologist forever. So I would like to recommend two possible alternatives for effective engagement of anthropologists with respect to public policy and state. First of all, we need to make anthropological research available in a usable form to a wider audience. Now, wider audience means that if audience reads that paper or that material, they accept the argument. If they agree or disagree is a different issue, but they should not ignore that particular issue. And the second thing, which is the last point which I would like to make, is that we need to actually turn our efforts to engage in transdisciplinary applied studies towards inclusion rather than isolation of communities from mainstream development. So I would close here, and if there is any question, thank you, and sorry for exceeding my time limits. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir, for such insightful reflections revolving around the dilemmas about validity and longevity of research during this pandemic, as well as the learning in the context of public policy and challenges encountered by a researcher in public policy domain. So, respecting the timelines for this session, I would like to invite our second speaker, Dr. Archana Shukla Mukherjee. She is presently the Senior Manager, Gender, Diversity and Inclusion at Change Alliance Private Limited. Her work revolves around marginalized communities, sustainable development, corporate social responsibility, gender equality, capacity building, and human rights. Welcome, ma'am. Over to you. Maybe we can dedicate 12 to 15 minutes, ma'am.
Sure.
15 minutes. Sorry. Yes, ma'am. Over to you, ma'am.
So, Chitra, since Avanish has already talked about the public policy and has given already the context on research methodologies related to public policy, I'll not probably repeat the same. So I will be only talking about the public policies which have a little larger impact on the corporate policies as well, and also their implementation mechanisms. So taking it forward from there, so in the public policies, one of the defining aspect of the global pandemic is the fundamental uncertainty associated with it, and we all are going through it. One important principle that government policy should follow is not to add further uncertainty, especially in difficult times. So there must be a pre-established forward-looking policy framework in place that commits to providing a safety net to vulnerable people, and this should widely publicize so that the people affected most know about what their entitlements are and how to access it. I'm talking basically in terms of, because we already did a study and our partners have also done certain studies on the relief packages announced by the government and access to social protection schemes. But the migrant workers who were going back to their homes, natives, almost 90% of these migrant workers vulnerable with no money in hand were not registered in any portal of the government. So accessing those kind of benefits was out of the question. So I think when we are talking about public policy and the corporate policy, one of the important domain which is missing is how to, and which Avnish has also talked about, how to connect the policy and practice. And I think for that, civil society organizations and their implementation is also certain things that link the both public policy and corporate policy with the people is important to recognize here. So considering that, in fact, somebody in the previous session also talked about if, should we go ahead with the traditional methods, or we have to go with the new methods and with the coming changes, whatever we are facing. So I think when we were doing our PhD in University of Delhi, so we were always told that the community, we always have a cultural gatekeeper, and we have to have a rapport with them. We have to engage with them. We have to take them into confidence, not only into confidence what we are doing, rather they should actually participate what we are, suggesting for that particular area. So similarly, there are certain organizations. For example, our organization, we have trained women on their digital literacy, and we call them Internet Sathis, and it is a program by Google and Tata Trust. And even the community leaders that we work with in the good governance programs and all, in this pandemic time, they are one of our important pillar, not only to provide information, authentic data, authentic information, but also the actual situation at the ground level where we are unable to reach through our telephonic connections or digital platforms. So I think those kind of things are very important to be considered by our upcoming anthropologists who are researching. Apart from that, I will also would like to connect on the short-term relief which already government has announced on food, COVID hygiene, transport, emergency cash related thing. But what is lagging is something related to social security, income or livelihood, how to prepare, how to support these workers to come back to, back to work, and the protection of their rights in terms of decent working conditions, prevention of forced labor, and they were already faced the issues of not getting salaries, layoffs and all that. So how to look into those aspects through the public policy is very important, because corporate policy you cannot look into in a very isolation. So it has to be looked from the public policy as well, apart from the corporate policy. In fact, the relaxation of the labor laws, where certain state governments like Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Himachal Pradesh, Punjab and UP, they have increased the working hours from 8 to 10 or 12 hours. In fact, temporary exemption from certain necessary provisions like safety, including toilets, drinking water, lighting, first aid equipment were not there. No inspection of the firms employing less than 50 workers. Amendment in the Industrial Dispute Act is already there, so that they can, lay off the people, number of the people they want to lay off. The Contract Labor Act diluted in not only that, limited submission of annual returns, which was not there. Fortunately, UP and Rajasthan were the two states who have withdrawn the proposal of this, but there are many states who are going ahead. So in this particular time, relaxation of labor laws has far-reaching adverse implications on the rights and well-being of the workers, including women and children. They are the most impacted sections of the community. And it is actually further contributing to informalization of the workforce. ILO has, I think, announced that the informalization of the workforce will go to 80 to 90% in India. So this is a little worrisome situation. And it is also going against many international ratifications that India has signed for decent work and workers' right, and also disproportionately impacting the women workers, lead to increased stress, domestic violence. You might be aware about the cases that are increasing hugely in this pandemic time. And as you know, we are already decreasing day by day on the female labor force participation rate. So our economy has to be looked into differently. And I think public policy plays a very, very important role. And just to counter this, especially in Jharkhand, we are trying to have a responsible migration facilitation center, which will strengthen the social security delivery system, ethical recruitment practices, enable workers' protection. In fact, you might be aware about the Delhi government has come up with a portal where they are trying to link the job seekers with the employers. But these kind of portals should not be regulated by government, but it should be promoted by government. That is more important. And there should be other players who understand the community well. And I think there our knowledge of anthropology comes into being, that we understand the communities, the vulnerabilities within the community, social exclusion, gender issues. We understand it really well. And there comes our contribution. And that is how we make ourselves, important in this kind of field, and that is how we're working. So these are certain parameters that has to be looked into. As the nation faces unprecedented public health crisis, business are grappling with how to support their workforce, and we have seen it in the last 3-4 months. They are unable to implement the emergency policies, only certain sections of the sector, and that too they are guided by the public policies. Very, very limited research. So I will probably not be a good person to talk about research methodologies in the corporate policies, because they are guided certain times based on their interaction with the workers, and certain times, most of the times, by the public policies. 1 million of workers, especially workers who are paid low wages, are facing dire extremes, and we all agree and understand that. Companies have established, few of the companies that I work with they have come up with the specific policies and procedures, capabilities of employee communications, telecommuting, and personal family leaves to minimize disruptions and all that. Supply chain disruption is hugely there in the sector. And just to give you an example, I work a lot with certain international buyers like Marks and Spencer, Levi's, Superdry, Mothercare, and all. And I work with their first year. So this is very important, that I work with their first year of the suppliers, who are themselves Arvind Mills, Aditya Birla, and all that, huge in their own setting. But and almost 60 to 70% of these employees or workers are women in this sector. And with the limited education, lack of skill, 80% of them are migrant workers. And above that, when all this pandemic situation happens, the buyers started canceling the orders and also asking for the discounts. And they have not taken the stocks, so no payment to the suppliers. So I think purchasing practices of the buyers and retailers have to be changed and has to be looked into, and which many of the trade unions, labor right organizations, government associations are trying to build up. But these are certain things with the corporate policies which will probably take a little longer time and commitment from the supply chain entire. So that is something has to be looked into. And when I talk about the business and human rights perspective, we already are into an era where we are talking about this year. We are talking about National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, and we already have national guidelines on responsible business conduct, and where the Principle 5 talks about business and human rights, and how to not only respect the human rights, but also promote and support the human rights by the businesses. But hardly during the pandemic, I think we all got exposed by not doing what we are supposed to look into. And the protect, respect, and remedy framework totally got devastated into the entire pandemic, and we are not prepared. So I think there were certain articles talking about how we got our policies got exposed during this time, and this shows how responsible and committed to our workers we are. So I think one of the important aspects that I will like to focus on, apply a people first mindset. And that is very important. The very first priority of the organization during pandemic should be safety and well-being of its workforce. Employees are unable to focus on work responsibilities when their well-being and that of their family are in peril. And we all accept that, I'm sure. The critical question firms must address at the onset of the pandemic event is whether the employees are safe, followed by whether they are available to perform critical functions or not. It is important for the companies to be able to monitor the situation, provide a safe workplace, and offer their employees the support that they need in terms of the childcare, in terms of the transportation, in terms of the leaves that they require, and develop a robust communication strategy, which is very, and a two-way communication and employee tracking and to disseminate critical information by the companies are very important. The step that has to be looked into. Companies must challenge and stretch the boundaries for traditional resilience plans to address pandemic events. During a pandemic, some of the standard strategies such as work transfer to alternate sites, relocations of the workforce, and staff augmentation may not be viable options, as personal and alternate location site may not be just as impacted by the event. So I think they have to look into all of it. I'm just last pointers which businesses and especially the leaders of the companies have to look into is communicate with employees to raise awareness, enforce policies, and familiarize them with the available tools and resources. If pandemic planning consideration have not been incorporated into existing business continuity and disaster recovery strategies or updated, begin rapid planning and refresh of pandemic strategies and actions. There is a requirement to perform immediate assessment of the processes of the functions. Review crisis communication plan and designate single point of contact to facilitate seamless engagement with the local, national, global authorities, and also with the both internal and external stakeholders. Identify potential policy exceptions and institute a crisis management exception approval processes. Confirm employees have the requisite capabilities, including access to requisite shared drives, documents, others. And these are very small steps to be taken, but review of the relevant standard operating procedures and manuals, if updation is required, how to do that. Monitor the situation and provide regular briefings to leaders on an emerging threats and issues. Update contact information of the employees if required. Conduct brief pandemic training with the employees to enhance employee and organizational preparedness to respond effectively. These are the certain steps that is important. And we are continuously talking here about the digital platforms and all. We did a study with the garment workers and first tier suppliers of these garment workers, supposed to be formalized sector. And we found that only 18% of the women use the smartphones, while others are not having access to even internet. Even those who are having the smartphone, they do not have access to the internet, while almost 85% of the men use. So there is a, social inclusion and gender issues has to be looked into, and there is a need to look into the intersectionality as well when we are talking about public and corporate policies, which is required.
Sorry to interject, ma'am.
I'm done.
My apologies. My humble request to close the talk within 1 to 2 minutes so that
I'm done.
we can avoid spilling over into the next session.
Chitra, I'm done.
Ma'am, you may still continue for 1 or 2 minutes.
No, I'm done. I think probably we'll happy to take up the questions. I mean, there are so many people putting questions, so probably we'll give that time to them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for the deliberation focusing on the vulnerability of the marginalized, especially the migrant laborers during this pandemic, and the aspects of short-term relief packages, social security aspects, and law to cope with the pandemic, and the role of public policies to basically help cope with the pandemic during as well as afterwards. Thank you very much for your deliberation, ma'am. Maybe we can move forward. We have 10 minutes left to the question answers. We have received So, a couple of them. First, I would take up the question for Professor Avanish Kumar. There is a query that, just one moment. Yeah, so one of the queries is from Ayushi Malhotra that a critique remains that because of local level or contextual focus of anthropologists and a very generic nature of policy interventions, there remains a gap in the two. And while anthropological interventions can be strategically significant for a small program or a small population, policy making requires generalizations and wider focus. So, what are the views on this aspect?
I think he or she is absolutely right that has always been basically in between being limited to a small scope of area or so. But the way to go is that one has to understand that anthropology as a discipline provides the principle and the processes. Now, as far as the product of what the scheme could be, can be decentralized, but there are some challenges even for government, because one has to understand that government cannot have with every change in the culture or the domain of context. So what we need to do is that if you see what he is saying, and if you can correlate with the national tribal policy also, which has remained for more than 20-25 years as draft, that we are not able to take sides, we are not able to take conceptualize what are the areas of contention and how do we come out of it. So when he says that there is a challenge of going beyond the context of a community, we need to understand that government may not be having policies for all the communities and different levels. So there has to be a stated principles and also the purpose of policy, because if you go by the definition of public policy is the purposive statement which all the stakeholders who are working for it needs to abide by. So it is not about the product, it's the purpose. So the purpose of policy can be consensus drawn and it can be overall change.
So the next question is, how do you see the role of advocacy anthropology in the field of higher education policy research?
I think advocacy is a very important dimension of policy studies and also anthropology, because I believe every anthropologist is an advocate of some kind of change. But where do we lie as a problem? I tell you what, my interaction, because I teach to basically the bureaucrats. So my interaction with them suggests that what we are good at it is finding faults and problems. And we lead to opposition, we lead to a kind of change which is basically through opposition. Now, nobody today, as far as I understand, actually respect for finding faults. If there is a doctor is not paid for finding the disease. The doctor is paid and respected because he or she can cure the disease. So I think what we need to come up with is more of solutions. What can be done about it? If you just say this is a problem, nobody caters to it because everybody knows the problem. What people are not aware is, so I think what I would suggest is that if you can focus on in policy 2-3 things, then it is much more acceptable as an advocacy. One is that you need to see the administrative ease of doing that particular proposition which you want to propose. The second thing is that it's very difficult for government to go beyond something which is not equitable. By equitable, I mean something which is unfair, inequity is unfair or unjust. And third is that it should lead to some kind of cost efficiency. I'm not talking about cost benefit. That's a part of the corporate style. Government cost efficiency means that they have to deliver health and education, but they have to look for something efficient. So I think if they can look for it, it may be a good idea because the new policy has come. There are a lot of opportunities of advocacy. It will require some evidence-based advocacy. It may not be a hypothetical advocacy. That will work.
Thank you very much, sir, for your responses. The next question may be for Dr. Mukherjee. So, ma'am, the question is, in times during uncertainty, that is downsizing and delay in payment of wages due to COVID-19 pandemic lurking around, how does corporate social responsibility in private companies assures safety of employed married women and women on maternity leave?
Chitra, I probably have lost you for a couple of seconds. Can you just repeat first
Sure,
2-3
ma'am.
lines?
Sure, ma'am. Sure, ma'am. So the question is, in times of uncertainty, that is downsizing and delay in payment of wages due to COVID-19 pandemic lurking around, how does corporate social responsibility in private companies assures the safety of employed married women and women on maternity leave? You may also read this question is posed at 2:44 p.m.
Fine, Chitra, I got it. No, I probably lost your voice in between. Anyways, I got it. Yeah. So when you're trying to connect the downsizing or layoffs with the corporate social responsibility, let me tell you, the corporate social responsibility is entirely different from the safety that we are talking about, or maternity. So it all comes under the Factories Act and labor laws and other things, which the contract labor laws that we talk about, the safety of the women or maternity benefits, creche facilities and all that. While corporate social responsibilities, if you might have seen in the recent times during the pandemic, it all diverted to PM cares. So almost 90% of the funds of the CSR has already gone to PM cares, and that's a kind of liability to them. And most of the community activities for which this particular CSR is meant to is on halt currently. And I work on a lot on the CSR and with all the large companies. And we got to know that the projects which used to get whatever the amount, they're getting 10% of it. So continuing the entire community interventions or other aspect of within that amount is very, very less. But when you talk about the welfare activities does not come under CSR. So be clear about that. While if you look into the exemption and the labor laws already, so what is happening? The creches are not required to be there. Toilets are not required to be there. Drinking water is not required because you've got the exemption to have all those facilities. And forget about maternity benefit because that is not there at all. So the labor laws, which is by the state governments, now these people are not going to work, especially the women who are supposed to take care of the care work, unpaid care work at home, or take care of the household chores. They are unable to, and even the factories are not very interested to employ them because then they have to, look into their other issues of childcare and other things. So which is already not there, and so they are not going to work. So that is one of the biggest issue, that in this pandemic, the most hit was on the women, because now they are unable to go to work, especially to the factories and to the states where these laws got exempted. And it has nothing to do with CSR. CSR is kind of charity to the in the companies, and it's a philanthropy kind of thing, just mandatory by the government of India. That is it.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for your response. And we may probably send all the rest of the queries to the speakers from the audience. And thank you very much, Professor Avanish Kumar and Dr. Archana Shukla Mukherjee, ma'am.